Hi, everyone. Welcome to the May 7th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. Well, the Kentucky Derby's over. There was so much build-up, and sometimes in these situations with a race like the Derby, there's the potential for the actual event to be somewhat anticlimactic. I don't think that was the case this year because people are still talking about this race days afterwards. Obviously, the race itself was exciting. There was the aftermath of what followed, which has provoked a lot of discussion, and Craig and I are going to dive into it on this podcast. We'll talk about all of the trips. We'll talk about some of the pace of the race and how it unfolded for a number of main contenders. After we talk about the Derby, we'll look back at some of the other major stakes action from Churchill Downs last weekend, including the feature race on Friday, the Kentucky Oaks for the 3-year-old fillies. And if we have some time at the end of the podcast, we'll wrap up some thoughts about Belmont Park on Saturday and Sunday, because they had some stakes there over the weekend as well. So I'm David Aragona, TimeformUS analyst, and I'll go ahead and welcome in my co-host, Craig Milkowski, the TimeformUS chief speed figure maker. Craig, how are you doing, and recovered from all of the talk of last weekend?
I'm getting there. I kind of tuned it all out yesterday after a busy Saturday and Sunday, kind of, took it easy and relaxed, got away from it a bit. So looking forward to talking about it today.
Yeah, I tried to not engage with you too much on Twitter this weekend so we could have a bit of a fresh discussion about this right now. I guess we'll start by talking about the Derby and just how the race unfolded for the top contenders and the winner. I'll let you talk a little bit about the pace of this race, because I think that's a good place to start. It was kind of an unusual pace situation, especially for a race like the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, it really was. It's very rare that we ever have a race where we have some fractions coded in red and some in blue. Usually when I've seen it happen, it's at the 1.5 mile distance where some horse runs off and then everybody just kind of lets them go. And in a way, this race was sort of like that, not quite to that extreme. But, I think the horse who crossed the finish line first, Maximum Security, who I called by some odd name the other day, which showed how worn out I was, I think. But Maximum Security, he used his early speed to establish that lead, but then he was able to really back it down and slow the race down to the point where by the mile mark, and with a 1/4 mile to go in the race, the field was so bunched up. I think it led to a lot of the trouble that we saw that eventually led to the disqualification of the first place finisher.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to dive into a real pace discussion, because something that I think is getting lost in this whole analysis of the disqualification and what happened on the far turn, people are really focused on that one part of the race. And in the course of that conversation, everyone is just sort of taking for granted this idea that Maximum Security ran by far the best race. But I think people are forgetting to note that Maximum Security also had a lot of things go his way in this race, especially through the middle portion of the race, because he got a really long breather down the backstretch where he was able to back down the pace to a really pronounced degree. You rarely see horses that go so fast early in the race able to back down the pace to that extent, where looking at the raw fractions, the 2 1/4 miles that were the third and fourth quarters went faster than the fifth quarter, rather slower than the fifth 1/4 mile of the race. The final 1/4 mile was actually faster than the preceding 2, which is really rare to see in a race like the Kentucky Derby. And credit to Maximum Security for showing the ability to re-brake at the top of the stretch like that and still hold off all those horses after slowing down towards the middle portion of the race. But the fact that he backed down the pace so much, as you were saying, it really did create some problems for the horses in behind him. And as they were moving down the backstretch, the field was just so bunched up. It almost reminded me of those videos you see of the Aintree Grand National, where you've got that bunched field of 30 horses about to go over the jumps at the start of that race, because you had about 15 horses within about 5 lengths of each other. And I think it created some traffic problems for a bunch of horses. And Maximum Security, he never got to take any dirt in his face. He got to avoid all of that. Don't get me wrong, he ran a fantastic race. I just want to temper some of the enthusiasm about how well he ran compared to the rest of the field, because there were plenty of other horses in this race who had more difficult trips who didn't lose by that much.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. Was he the best horse? I think that's debatable. I don't think it's cut and dried, as people are trying to say. What you noted about the last fraction, I just want to say it's especially true on a sloppy track to have the fifth quarter be faster than the preceding 2. I mean, it's rare enough on dirt as it is. But on slop, it's almost unheard of. So while, he did use his speed and he took the lead, which I was hoping maybe some other horses would try to do. They kind of conceded when he went quick, but, he was able to rate, which not all horses are able to do once you get them revved up early like that. So he obviously relaxed nicely on the lead. But again, I agree with you. Him getting away with that easy trip kind of made it really tough on some others in here, caused a lot of ground loss, a lot of traffic problems. And unfortunately, he's not running in the Preakness from what I've heard. But, it should make for an interesting Preakness trying to dissect all these trips that we're going to have to go through. I did listen to you and Andy Serling's Across the Board podcast. I think you guys did a great job on there. And I know you won't mention it, so hopefully some people out there take a listen to it, because you guys go through every horse, every trip, and I think you did a great job on there.
Oh, well, thanks for that. You were saying that I might have exhausted all my hot takes in talking to the race about him with the race, but there's still a lot more to say, I think, about the trips that some of the horses got. And I do want to address briefly the disqualification. I know there's been a lot of talk about it already. I think there's some misinformation being spread out there. And what disappoints me in this discussion is that there are so many eyes on racing and eyes on this race in particular. And it can be a good thing if we use it as an opportunity for education and to inform people about the rules of the sport and how a decision like this actually is representative of the sport having some integrity for following the rules, even in the most high profile race when there's a lot of pressure perhaps not to do so. So I think the stewards deserve credit for applying the same rules that they would apply to a random race on Wednesday to a race like the Kentucky Derby. So, I mean, I've made no bones about the fact that I agree with the disqualification. I think you can debate about how we adjudicate fouls in this country and whether or not we should be disqualifying horses at all. I think that's a completely separate discussion that I don't think we're going to have right now. But based on what the rules are, I think it's cut and dry that they had to disqualify this horse.
Yeah, I think it was a no-brainer. I actually had a friend of mine who's in New York with you, a guy named Evan Harris, who texted me shortly after the horses crossed the finish line. He said, this horse has to come down. And to be honest, watching live, I mean, I could see some traffic. I could see War of Will had some problems, but I didn't know the extent of it until they started showing the replays. And personally, when I was watching the race, I thought War of Will was just loaded. And I thought once he got clear, he was going to be a real threat to win the race. So I have absolutely no problem with the DQ. I mean, I really think he cost that horse some positions. The finish was tightly bunched. Yeah, he finished back in 8th, but there's no telling where he could have finished. I don't even think it's out of the question he could have won. So, no problem with the call on my end. I think it shows that the sport is policed pretty well. We're always going to disagree with calls. Anytime there's subjectivity in a race call or in a race decision on whether a horse should get disqualified or not, people are going to debate it. Of course, whether they bet the said horse or not, or the horse that gets put up will probably influence them. But I think objectively speaking, it was the right call, and I'd have had no problems with it regardless of how I had bet.
Yeah, the thing that really baffles me is this faction of people that are trying to argue that War of Will caused the incident, which I just can't even begin to wrap my head around. I know that there's a super slow motion video circulating that kind of makes it hard to see what happened at all because you're slowing it down to an infinite degree to the point where you're basically looking at a series of still images. It's just hard to really follow what's going on. And I think that's what people are using as evidence that something that didn't happen might have happened. I don't understand how you could try to blame the incident on the horse that was fouled. That just kind of boggles my mind. And the whole litany of conspiracy theories that are being thrown around, I mean, they're just poisonous to educating fans about the rules of the sport and what actually happened. And it's disappointing to see that because this is a great opportunity for education about the sport. And I think some people are just kind of squandering that by promoting and engaging in theories about a race that they should know, because I don't want to disparage people who are new to the sport and are not experienced race watchers. They might see something that they just need a little bit of education to really understand. but people that have experience watching races, some of them are promoting theories that I think they know can't possibly be true. So that's disappointing to me. Just to briefly touch upon some other horses in this race, I thought Game Winner ran exceptionally well. There's been a lot of talk about how much ground he lost, and it really is true. He was insanely wide around that far turn. And the other horse I really want to mention and get your take on is Master Fencer, who made this insane late move in the final quarter mile. I mean, we talked about how the entire field sped up in the last quarter mile because they all got that breather in the middle portion of the race. But his last quarter was just a shade over 24 seconds flat. You almost never see that in a race like the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, he was absolutely flying. I did want to touch on Game Winner. And while I agree, he totally did. He lost a lot of ground. It's pretty obvious. But I did hear you guys talk about the trackish chart. I wouldn't put a lot of faith in that. Having watched the replay and looked at the ground loss, I'm not sure how accurate that is for that race. I don't know what happened. It didn't come up till well after the other races. I'll leave that to others. But I'll just say he was exaggerated, but that doesn't mean he didn't have a very tough trip. He was good. Master Fencer, I'm really curious to see if they're going to keep him here. I haven't heard anything about the Preakness. I'm sure people will mention the Belmont just because of the way he was finishing. He ran very similar to what he did in Japan. He just is a horse that drops out and makes a big run. But as you say, he was really flying in a race where horses weren't backing up for the most part. They were, as you said, quickening up that last quarter. He was still making up ground, and it was hard not to notice him because he was so much noticeably faster than basically the rest of the field other than Game Winner, who was moving pretty well also.
Yeah, no, I thought he ran a fantastic race, and he'll be an intriguing contender if he moves on to the Belmont Stakes, which is what I think they're considering for his next start. That seems like a good fit for him, as well as a few others who I think will be skipping the Preakness and moving on to the Belmont, like Tacitus. We'll see what they do with Game Winner. I think the Belmont would be a good race for him as well. That could be a race that draws some really talented horses, because it does seem like a few of them will be skipping the Preakness this year. We'll move on from the Derby and talk about some of the undercard races from Churchill Downs on Saturday, and we'll take them in reverse order, starting with the race that occurred right before the Derby. That was the Old Forester Turf Classic, won by Bricks and Mortar, who is in the midst of a fantastic season, winning his third graded stakes in a row, his second grade one. Just a really nice horse who overcame the race flow because not a lot of horses were making up ground in this spot, and he just mowed them down in the stretch.
He did. Before we get too much into this, we didn't even mention the speed figures for the Derby. I want to mention Maximum Security ran a 120. The 2-3 finishers, Country House and Code of Honor, both got a 118. And to be fair, that's kind of subpar for a Kentucky Derby. It's not really surprising because we didn't have huge figures coming into the race. 120 was about where the horses had been running, and that's what they got on this day. So anyway, back to Bricks and Mortar.
No, but we can touch upon the speed figures. Sorry, I'm moving a little too quickly. I didn't want to spend too much time on the Derby because I know there's so much to talk about. I agree with you. There were no breakout performances. I thought 120 is okay for Maximum Security. What was really striking to me in this Derby is how many horses ran speed figures of 115 and above. The top 9 finishers all got speed figures between 115 and 120. So you had a lot of horses running some of their best races in this spot. It's just, as we kind of figured would be the case based on the preps, a lot of their best races are all pretty similar. This still seems like a really closely matched group, and I think it could create a really competitive series of races moving on to the Preakness and Belmont.
Yeah, I agree. And we just didn't have that fast pace we usually get that kind of gaps the field. So exactly. That had something to do with the bunching, kept a lot of horses in contention later than they normally would be. So very interesting Derby, and I'm really looking forward to the Preakness more than I have been in a long time as a bettor.
Me too. And I'll be interested to see who shows up, because there are some new faces, some of which I'm a little bit skeptical of. I think some of the horses that will be coming out of the Derby are pretty solid. Even a horse like Improbable is probably going to appreciate a slight cut back in distance. He seems like the one of the Baffert trio that is definite to go to the Preakness. But I'll be interested to see who shows up, and it could change a little bit in the upcoming weeks. I know as the Derby gets a little further away, some connections tend to have a change of heart and some consider the race, whereas initially they sometimes don't. So I'll be interested to be following the news stories and see how that shakes out in the upcoming week or so. I think we've covered the Derby at this point. So if you want to comment on bricks and mortar, we could move on to some of the undercard races. I was really impressed by his performance. I know it maybe wasn't the strongest grade one field of turf horses we've ever seen, but he just continues to show up with really solid efforts, bricks and mortar.
Yeah, he seems to do whatever he has to do. Whether the pace is slow, he's right up on it. If the pace is a little quicker, he's off of it. He just gets it done. And I know it's really early in the year to talk about this, but he's a horse that's putting himself in the horse of the year contention with the resume he's putting together. He's running fast. He's winning grade ones. He won the Pegasus Turf. And in a year where the older males outside the sprint division don't look very good, the 3-year-olds are shaky at best. I think he's leading the division right now. Just a really solid horse that shows no signs of stopping.
He seems like a horse that Chad Brown is going to have to make a decision about at some point later in the late summer and fall, because his next couple of starts seem pretty logical. I imagine they're going to go to the Manhattan next. After that, I would think they'll go to the Arlington Million. But at some point, you've got to decide, is this horse going to be pointing to the Breeders' Cup Mile or the Breeders' Cup Turf? I would lean towards the Breeders' Cup Mile for a horse like this. I don't really get the sense he's a 1.5 mile type. But these horses can change over time, and he certainly has handled a 1 3/16 better than I ever thought he could as a 3-year-old, as he did in the Pegasus World Cup Turf Invitational earlier in the year. So maybe he does have more stamina than he initially showed as a 3-year-old. But I think his connections have to make that choice at some point, because he really does seem like a horse that relishes the 1 1/8 distance.
Yeah, he does. And I guess we'll learn more. I think that Manhattan's 1.25 miles, if I'm not mistaken. And obviously the Arlington Million is. So, if he does well in there, I imagine that we'll get some signs of whether he could possibly handle longer or would do better with a turn back. Speaking of turn backs, we had Mr. Money in the Pat Day Mile, who coincidentally enough ran a slightly better figure than the Kentucky Derby winner with a 121, and was just very impressive doing it. He stayed relatively close to what was a pretty fast pace. And once he took over, he just ran away from this field in the stretch. And I think he's being pointed to the Preakness, which, obviously is at a second turn where he struggled a little bit, but he almost looked like a new horse on Saturday to me. Could have been that it was the slop, but he's definitely one that I'll be interested in Baltimore.
Yeah, this is a horse that I actually picked in the race and liked quite a bit coming into it. He was obviously helped by the fact that Instagram did not show up for whatever reason. I have not read the articles or seen any quotes about this. I'm not sure what the story is with Instagram, but something obviously happened to him because he was not himself in this race. Mr. Money is a funny horse because his connections had gotten really aggressive with him as a 2-year-old, running him in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile just off a maiden win. So they clearly thought a lot of him. If you remember, he had a setback earlier in the year. I believe he got sick and had to miss the Lecomte. So they had to rush him to make the Prison Star. Then he just didn't get the distance in the Louisiana Derby, so it seemed. But they were just kind of playing catch up with him. And I think he's a horse, as much as the turn back helped, I think it just helped that they took a step back with him and stopped targeting the Derby and ran him in a race like this. And he really just got the opportunity to shine. As you were saying, he looked loaded throughout the race. I know there were stories about how he was working very well coming into this race, better than he had before. And he ran to those workouts because he just took over on the far turn, absolutely dominated this field. I know Hog Creek Hustle, who was second. He's no great shakes. He's okay. He picks up pieces in these grade 2 and grade 3 stakes races. I think he, too, did appreciate the turn back, though. But regardless of who he was beating, he won this race decisively. As you were saying, the speed figure came back really solid. We'll see about a race like the Preakness. I'm not sure that he's really a 7-furlong horse, so I don't think he's the kind that I would want to see pointing to a race like the Woody Stevens. So maybe they do try the Preakness. That perhaps makes the most sense. We'll see if he gets the distance, but he's clearly in very good form right now.
He is. And like you said, Hog Creek Hustle, he's a pretty good barometer. And he's not a grade horse, not a grade 1 horse, but he pretty much always shows up. He's always finishing his races off. And Mr. Money was just running away from him even. He actually looked like he was going to, pose a threat at the top of the stretch, and it was no contest. So big effort for Mr. Money. Be curious to see where he goes. And it's a very strong race, I think, and it's good to see him put it together.
Yeah, the Pat Day Mile is a fun race. I think every year it produces a strong performance and a horse that really needs that turn back in distance. Sticking with the 3-year-olds, on the turf, we saw Digital Age stay undefeated, win the American Turf in his third career start. Really, he's taken huge strides forward in each career appearance. He had a terrible trip in his debut at Tampa Bay Downs earlier this winter, made some strides in his stakes debut there, but this was far and away his best performance yet because he beat some nice runners in the Thread of Blue and Social Paranoia, both of whom had recorded some fast speed figures at Gulfstream Park this winter.
Yeah, he got a 112, which was his career best. Amazingly, I don't know how this horse paid 8-1. Seemingly every single person I knew thought Digital Age was going to win this race. It was one of the more baffling things I've seen. That this horse paid whatever it was, $19, I think it was. But I thought all three of the top horses in this field ran a good race. I thought he ran well, Thread of Blue ran well, and so did Social Paranoia. I think it's a pretty solid crop of 3-year-old turfers, and I imagine Digital Age will be pointing to the Belmont Derby. I don't know if there'll be a race in between or not, but big effort from him. I was impressed. The pace was decent. It wasn't super fast, and he was still able to run these horses down late. So good field, but I think he was clearly best and earned the win.
Yeah, it's funny. Coming into this weekend at Churchill Downs, Chad Brown and Klarovich Stables, they had gone over to Europe to buy some 2-year-olds out of the Tattersall, or some rather yearlings out of the Tattersall sale in 2017. And I think they've run 3 horses so far, and they had won with all of them, and a few of them had won multiple starts. And if you had tried to guess which one would lead to the first defeat, I don't think most people would have said it was Newspaper of Record instead of Digital Age, because they both are in that same situation. But we'll get to her in a second. But Digital Age stayed undefeated in this race. I agree. A race like the Belmont Derby would be perfect for him. He seems to have the pedigree to go longer distances. He just has that late kick where he just keeps on coming. I'm a fan of this horse. I agree. I'm not sure how he paid 8-1. I guess he's the kind of horse where you really had to dig into his races to know how good he is, because his speed figures didn't get anywhere near telling the whole story on him. He just looked a little inferior based on numbers. But if you're into watching races, you could see this horse had some talent, and interested to see where he goes from here, because he took such a big step forward in this race. If he could take a similar step forward in future starts, he could be a real star for this Chad Brown barn. The big race of the weekend in terms of speed figures, the highest number that we assigned, I think, to any horse was for Mitole in the Churchill Down Stakes at the 7 furlongs. This was a loaded field going in. It seemed like a field that had a ton of speed signed on. The fast pace that I think we were predicting didn't really develop in that sense, but it was a contested pace. And Mitole showed a new dimension, stalking the pace and coming with that same strong finish that we've seen from him in the races where he's able to control up front. I was really impressed by Mitole in this spot, because I know we both had some questions about him coming into the race, and he really silenced any of the critics that were still out there.
Yeah, we did. It was. I remember you posted his past performances that were just littered with blue fractions everywhere, indicating he had been in slow-paced races. But, it just turns out sometimes with horses like that, they're just that good. And when they get challenged, they're able to step up to the task. And he did it easily. And I'm really hoping, I had mentioned, I think the last time he ran, that I thought he was a horse that could probably go as far as a mile. I'd love to see him in the Met Mile. And I'm hoping that'll be his target, where he's going to meet some other really fast horses going a little longer. But, I think he's up to the task. He's an exciting horse in a weak division of routers, but the sprinters certainly are pretty good this year. We're going to talk about World of Trouble later, I assume. But, just a super impressive effort. He just sat right off the speed and put these horses away and won pretty easily. I was impressed with the 2-3 finishers as well. They hooked up in a duel, and Bobby's Wicked One is in career best form. Promises Fulfilled seems to be rounding back to the form he was in last year. So right now, I think the older Merrill sprinters are much better division than the older routers.
Yeah, some people might be tempted to say that this is a race where the pace held together, or that it was a pace situation that favored the front runners. I tend to think that the top 3 were just the best horses in the race. And horses like Whitmore, I thought, had their chance to close in. He just couldn't quite get the 7 furlongs. Duchère was trying to close from the back of the pack. I know it was a little bit bunched early, but they really created some separation around the far turn. And I just thought the top 3 were just the best horses in the race. Bobby's Wicked One, he really validated that Commonwealth performance. I think kind of throws some cold water on that theory that the Keeneland track was exceptionally speed favoring that day, because he came back and really repeated that effort on a fair race track in this race. And I just thought Mitole beat a couple of fast horses who showed up in Promises Fulfilled and Bobby's Wicked One and really solidified his spot atop this sprint division. And like you, I'd love to see him in the Met Mile facing off against McKinsey, who I would assume is also going to go there off his win on Friday, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, that would be good. McKinsey ran well. We'll get to him in a minute. But, yeah, there's no reason to my eye why this horse can't go further. He's shown it all along that he rates nice even when he's on the lead. Now we know he can race off the lead, and he got 7 furlongs. So just a really exciting horse. I was happy to, I was lucky enough to get to see him at Oaklawn. He's a nice looking horse in person and really good on the screen. Just a fabulous sprinter right now. And he's probably past Roy H as leading the division until that one comes back and can show us he's the same horse.
Yeah, I would imagine so, because with horses like Mitole, who have put up the kind of speed figures that he has, really all he had to do at this point was win a grade 1 race or a grade 2 race. And he finally got that done here. So he's definitely at the top of the division. About 45 or 50 minutes before we saw Mitole, Beau Recall was able to win the Distaff Turf Mile for the fillies and mares on going a mile on the turf. This is a horse that we had talked about in the Pacecast a few weeks ago. She had been winning some lower-level races at the fairgrounds ever since she got a trainer switch to Brad Cox over the winter. And while she was beating up on inferior competition down there, she had really been pretty visually impressive in some of those races. And she showed that she could handle the step up in class against these solid graded stakes level fillies at Churchill on Saturday, because she rallied from way back in the pack, whereas nobody else was making that kind of run. And she just rocketed past these horses in the last quarter mile. Pretty impressive win by this filly.
Yeah, it was. This one surprised me. I didn't see this race coming. I saw Marcus Hirsch of DRF talking about it. So I know I wasn't the only one that was baffled. I mean, I wasn't shocked that she ran well, but I thought she was a little bit over her head in here. This is one cost me a pick 3 not using her. My wife was giving me dirty looks because she actually liked this horse. And I didn't put her in like a knucklehead, but she ran really well. It feels like she should be about an 8-year-old mare by now, because it seems like she's been running forever to me. She turns up in all these races, and she always shows up, and this was by far her biggest win. She got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure, and, solid effort. And then maybe she's turned a corner for Brian Cox. She looks like a new filly than the one we saw in California.
Yeah, I know there were a few fillies that didn't show up with perhaps their best efforts in this race. Precious never really got involved. Proctor's Ledge, we've seen better out of her in the past. Maybe she's just not the same horse anymore. But Got Stormy, who was second, she had really shown some improvement in her prior start in the Jenny Wiley, finishing a good third in that race. So she's obviously in very good form right now. And I thought Beau Recall just ran her down fair and square. It's not like this pace was very fast. I know there were a couple of red color-coded fractions, but I thought overall the pace was pretty fair. We didn't see that many horses coming from way back. So, Beau Recall, just a really solid effort by an older mare who seems to be in the best form of her career. So nice job by her and the Brad Cox barn getting her to run this performance. Sticking with the fillies and mares back on the dirt, we saw Mia Mischief really get back to her best races as well, because she had made a couple of starts so far as a 4-year-old, and I know neither of us were exceptionally impressed with those efforts, even though she finished first and second in those at Oaklawn. But she seemed to get back to her best efforts from her 3-year-old season, back early in that season, because she really had kind of tailed off towards the end of the year last year by winning this Humana Distaff. 125 TimeformUS speed figure, really respectable for this division, and she just dominated throughout that race.
She did. This was actually a horse I was lucky enough to bet that was part of the pick 3 that I blew by not including Beau Recall. The more I looked at the field, I just had a feeling she might be sitting on the top. Steve Asmussen had been hot. He won just a ton of races, it felt like, over the weekend. And he had this horse in best form. It was a fast track. She had seen the slop before, but she didn't get the slop many were anticipating earlier in the card. But she just blew these guys away. She never looked like she was going to lose to me. She sat right off of Amy's Challenge, who we've discussed here many times. I just think 7 furlongs is just a little bit out of her scope. At 6 furlongs, she's very tough, but 7's just a little tough at this top competition. So big effort from Mia Mischief. And as you say, that 125 is a big figure in this division. It's right up there with all the horses we've seen other than Come Dancing, who I assume we'll talk about a little later.
Yeah, I thought Marley's Freedom, who was the heavy favorite in this race at 4-5, she kind of ran her usual race. She got the 119, I believe, and finishing second. And the thing about Marley's Freedom was she probably deserved to be the favorite in this race. It's just she hadn't really gotten back to that exceptional performance we had seen out of her in the Ballerina last year ever since. And while she probably was going to run another good race here, she would be vulnerable if the horse really made a breakout performance like Mia Mischief did, and that proved to be the case. Mia Mischief's always been a really nice horse, and as you were saying, Steve Asmussen just has her in top form right now. I was really impressed, and I think it'll be interesting to see these two hook up again in the future, her and Marley's Freedom. Amy's Challenge, yeah, the 7 furlongs just seems like it's a bit too far from her. I knew it was a little bit problematic on the turn when Mia Mischief went with her when she tried to spurt away from the field, Amy's Challenge, and she was just swallowed up at the top of the stretch. So a fast race by the winner and a really impressive performance. The last race we'll talk about from Saturday was not one of the stakes races, but it was one of the faster speed figures that was put down on Saturday, and that was in the second race. It was an allowance event where Thirst for Life ran down Bob Baffert's American Anthem, who was coming off a lengthy layoff. Thirst for Life was a long shot in this race. He's a horse that had shown some promise earlier in his career. He had been off form for a long time. I don't know where this race really came from, but he put forth a pretty fast effort to get a 126 for this 1 mile allowance.
Yeah, he did. This was the head scratcher for me. I mean, the horse definitely had the back races to run a number like this. He had won a nice race at Churchill with a 120, I think, last year. But he had just been in dreadful form. His 2 races since he had come back from a layoff were just nothing could have pointed to this. I'm not a workout guy. Maybe he had been working well. I didn't really read up on it too much, to be honest. I think I was still in bed when this race kicked off, knowing there was still going to be a long day ahead of me. So I watched it on replay, and it was really, despite the weather we had later, the figures on the card were easy to make. I didn't have any issue giving him a big number. American Anthem ran well. He actually got a slightly higher number due to a quicker pace at 127, but it was a big gap back to third. I think it was a good 8 lengths between second and third. So no problem with the big number. I don't know where it came from, and we'll see if he can back it up next time out.
Yeah, I agree. Fast race. The second place finisher, American Anthem, probably going to go on to some graded stakes in the future. I imagine Bob Baffert will come up with an ambitious campaign for him because he really did get back to his best form in this race. Just got beat by a horse who ran a little bit better on the day. We'll dial it back to Friday and talk about the Kentucky Oaks card, and we'll begin with the main event, the Kentucky Oaks. This was another race that sparked a lot of discussion about trips, especially when it comes down to the start of the race, because there was an incident where Positive Spirit unfortunately clipped heels and lost her rider. She took a bit of a fall. Everyone was okay, though. It was quickly apparent. But Serengeti Empress kind of took advantage of that trouble that some of the other speed horses were involved in, because she got over to the inside from the outside post, got a clear lead, which I know a lot of people were surprised about. Motion to Motion and Mike Smith just kind of allowed her to do it. I think that was the plan for that horse. And Serengeti Empress, when she gets a clear lead, we've talked about it a lot of times previously on this Pacecast. She's very dangerous when she's up front alone. You can tell that she just loves it out there when she's setting the pace, and they just couldn't catch her in the stretch.
Yeah, and you have to say she earned it. I mean, she set some legit fractions. It's not like she was loping out there. Being clear, of course, we've talked about it before. Even when you're going fast, being clear is an advantage. And I totally agree about motion to motion. That's some just baffling strategy to me. I mean, if you don't think you can make the lead and win with that horse, a horse who got run down twice at shorter distances on a clear lead, you probably shouldn't even go in the Oaks. So anyway, I'll leave that stuff to the trainer and the rider. Puzzling decision. I'm not sure how we can figure that one out as handicappers, but it's a big effort. And what a great training job by Tom Amos to get this horse off that effort in Louisiana where she bled, to get her right and be able to run this big race. She got a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure. So not the fastest Oaks we'll see. That was bumped up 4 points because of the fast pace. But a good effort, never in doubt. Leora ran a big race at huge odds, definitely a lifetime best with a 111 for her. And Lady Apple basically matched her race at Oaklawn last out.
Yeah, Leora was kind of like the country house of the Kentucky Derby. She was the kind of filly who had been around there, gotten some checks in a few of these prep races, but hadn't really established herself as one of the top contenders. she ran her best race in the Oaks. She really stepped forward, and I thought gave a real challenge to Serengeti Empress and briefly looked like she might forge past that filly, but Serengeti Empress is just so game. She refused to relinquish that lead in the final eighth of a mile. I thought they both ran really well in the division that had been lacking some top-level performances. I know Bellafina had run well in some shorter races earlier in the year, but aside from her, we had kind of been waiting for horses to run some faster speed figures, and we saw it out of Serengeti Empress in this race. Among those that finished towards the back or behind these top three, I thought Champagne Anyone didn't get the best trip. She was a little too far back in the early going in a really bunched field. She was a little keener than usual with the blinkers on. It worked for her in the Gulfstream Park Oaks because she was close to the pace. Didn't work so well when she was so far off the pace and she had to weave through traffic and close. And we should mention Bellafina. She got hurt in the trouble at the start, was just kind of pushed to the back of the pack, and she was just never going to win from there. To be honest, I thought she actually ran okay because she was really never in a good position, and she never quit. I mean, she could have backed up and finished towards in the last half of the pack, but she stayed on well, only lost third by about 3/4 of a length. I thought Bellafina ran okay in this race, and she's probably going to do a lot better going shorter in the future.
Yeah, she's a decent horse, but I think both you and I, neither one of us particularly cared for her in this race. Not so much that she's a bad filly. She certainly isn't, but just the reputation didn't match the accomplishment. She hadn't been running very fast and this year. So not really surprising. She had trouble, but I agree with you. I think she'd be a great horse in the filly and mare sprint later in the year. If they concentrated on shorter. Hard to say if they'll do that, though. There's bigger money going long. So, and I'm sure she can win some races back in California. She'll go back to facing, 4 and 5 horses and be 3 to 5. So I imagine that'll be the plan for now.
Yeah, I hope they target a race like the Test at Saratoga. I think that would be a perfect fit for her. I know these same connections, I believe, won that race with what's her name? American Gal a few years ago. I believe that was the name of the horse. And I think Bellafina would be a perfect fit for a race like that based on her performance at 7 furlongs into Santa Ynez earlier in the year. Sticking with the fillies and mares on the Friday card in the La Troienne, we saw the older horse, the 4-year-old filly, She's a Julie, put forth a nice effort. She got a very good trip. Another Steve Asmussen horse that came up with a big effort on Friday. And I've always liked She's a Julie. I was a little bit skeptical that we'd see the best of her going a mile on the 16th. I think a little bit longer might be what she really wants to do in the future. But she was able to wear down Secret Spice, who was coming in from California off some big efforts. And she put up a nice runner-up performance, but She's a Julie was just a little bit better on the day.
Yeah, She's a Julie. I'm a fan of hers. I've got to see her run here at Remington a few times. She won the Remington Oaks here. And so it's good to see the local horses for me going on the national stage, like Long Range Toddy in the Derby. He won, one of the divisions of the Rebel, but definitely a good horse with a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, which is really solid for this division. Puts her right up there as fast as anything we've seen, including the races at Oaklawn with, I can't believe the name's escaping me now. Midnight, whatever.
Midnight Bisou.
Thank you. Midnight Bisou. Maybe she's not quite in that same class, but I wouldn't mind seeing those two race against each other. And I don't think it would be a walkover by any means. I think she's right up there with them.
No, I agree with that. There are some really nice fillies out there right now. She's a Julie is obviously moving forward at the right time. We'll get to a filly that ran at Belmont Park this past weekend who might be in that conversation as well once we get to a race like the Ogden Phipps. But that's a race that could be coming up pretty strong if all of these horses wind up there because they're all putting forth some decent speed figures. And She's a Julie did that as well with this 123 she got in this race. It was nice to see Secret Spice finally put good races back to back because she had come up with these breakout performances sort of out of nowhere in her prior starts. And she really backed up that Beholder Mile that she ran in her prior start with another good effort in this La Troienne. So it's good to see her really put her name in the conversation as one of these top fillies and mares as well. Blue Prize, I think she'll do better in the future. This was her first start off the layoff, and she's needed to race off breaks in the past, so she probably just wasn't at her best for this race. But she's another one that could move forward out of this race. I think this was a good field, and we could see some horses do some nice things coming out of this field in the future.
Yeah, no doubt. Blue Prize ran well off the bench, and I do expect better from her next time.
Yeah, the Colts ran the Alysheba at the same distance earlier on this Friday card, and we were talking about Mitole earlier and how he could go on to the Met Mile in his next start, and I think we could say the same for McKenzie after he won this Alysheba. It was his first win of 2019, which kind of sounds weird to say because I know we've talked about McKenzie as perhaps one of the best older horses out there. He had finished second in a couple of races to start the year. He really ran well in this race, and I think it just solidifies the notion that he really does want to go a little bit shorter than the 1.25 mile classic distances. He's just not quite as good going the 1.25 mile, but he seems to have this really effective turn of foot when they turn him back slightly in distance. Mike Smith really rode him with confidence in this race, wasn't afraid to drop back coming around the far turn, come outside of Tom's d'Etat, and the kick that he showed coming off the far turn into the stretch was really impressive. I know it wasn't the toughest field, but the way he did it really encouraged me that he's going to have a big performance in the Met Mile.
Yeah, have you heard? Is that where he's being pointed? Because I know they have the Gold Cup at Santa Anita around the same time, I believe. So it'll be interesting to see.
I'm kind of actually, I should say, I'm kind of assuming. I know Bob Baffert had sent horses to the Net Mile in past years, and to me, that seems like a really good fit for this horse. I honestly wasn't even considering that they'd stretch him out again in the Gold Cup. Maybe they will. I guess that's also a valid option for him. But I'd certainly love to see him in the Net Mile. So maybe it's some wishful thinking on my part.
Yeah, I'd like to see him there too. Anytime we can get more competition, that's better for us as fans and bettors. This was a little bit of a tough figure race. I don't know if you remember, I initially put it out. It was a couple points lower. The Friday card was definitely tougher to make figures for than the Saturday card. The weather was iffy. It kind of changed a bit throughout the day. But I eventually settled a 128 for him. It was a really solid number. It's a grade 1 level number. It was an interesting, strangely run race, the way he let d'Etat take over. And, he almost looked beat. And then Mike Smith just got back into him, and he just blew the field away, asserted his class in there. So good effort. A couple other notes out of this one. Seeking the Soul ran okay. I think we know what he is by now. And then Silver Dust ran a 119 out of that race I had rated pretty lowly out of Louisiana. The reason I wanted to mention that is because you'll be happy to know I've went back and upgraded that one as of this morning. So when you check the charts tomorrow, you'll see that the race was broken out and has some different figures there.
I think I'm okay with that decision. I just was reading an article. Bob Baffert did mention the Met Mile as a potential next target for McKenzie. So that's good news because I think that could be a fantastic race. I agree with what you said about the way the race unfolded. It was not the fastest opening quarter. It was kind of slow, and they were all riding kind of tentatively early. I don't think Mike Smith really wanted to be in that position right up on the pace. So he really wasn't he didn't hesitate to back him off a little bit on the turn. I think he just knew he had the best horse underneath him, and he rode McKenzie that way. I agree. The horses in behind, they ran some of their usual speed figures in the low 120s, high 119, 1-teens. They're just not really in McKenzie's league. And he's a grade 1 level horse who put forth a grade 1 performance here. And he'll be moving back into that company next time out. World of Trouble, we were talking about Mitole earlier as one of the best sprinters in the country, perhaps the best sprinter in the country, but World of Trouble's in that conversation too, because he won the Twin Spires Turf Sprint, and he obviously is a versatile horse who can run on any surface, a number of distances, so they have a lot of options with him. They're taking an interesting path by formulating a campaign mixed with turf and dirt races, and they have that option because he's so versatile, but he was dominating a field of horses that were just overmatched. They really weren't in his league, and he just looked like a winner every step of the way on this Twin Spires Turf Sprint.
Yeah, he did. He's obviously one of the top sprinters out there with Mitole. He was helped a little bit by, well, not more than a little bit. He was helped by the scratch of the Wesley Ward horse. Is it Bound for Nowhere, I think it is, who basically made this a walkover. It looked like it was going to be a 2-horse field, but turned into a parade for World of Trouble. Really impressive. He got that 126 TimeformUS speed figure, which is, I think he's capable of better when he's challenged. He's run faster in the past. He hasn't run particularly fast as of late, but he's doing what he has to do to win. So I'm not going to hold that against him. He had that 112 last out. I think it was in the Carter at Aqueduct, but this is definitely a 130 horse in my opinion. He's grade 1 quality. I don't think he wants any longer, unlike Mitole, who we talked about earlier. I think this 5.5, 6 furlong distance is probably what he is going to be the best at. So not sure we would see a horse like him in the Met Mile, but he is definitely going to be a factor in the sprint division. Whether he tries turf or dirt this year, that could be interesting. The Breeders' Cup is at Santa Anita. I'm not sure he looks like a down-the-hill type horse to me, so I'd personally probably be leaning towards third if I were the connector.
Yeah, I would too. I know that the next target that they've mentioned for him is the Jaipur on Belmont Stakes Day. That has been elevated to a Grade 1 race as a turf sprint. So I think it makes sense to try to pick up a Grade 1 in that spot, given that division is a little bit muddled right now, and he really does seem to have a good handle on these turf races. So 6 furlongs is the right distance. I think he'd be very dangerous in that spot, and that seems like a good target. As for later in the year, I agree. I think the real prestige and the challenge for him could try to be to win a Grade 1 dirt race like the Breeders' Cup Sprint, because the downhill turf course, it's kind of a gamble for a horse like this, going to 6.5. I think it would be great to see him in a race like the Breeders' Cup Sprint, because he really is as good on the dirt, especially when they ride him properly, which they didn't in the Carter. They didn't ride him to produce a top speed figure that day. I agree. At his best, he's a 130 type horse, and I'm sure he'll get back to that in the future as long as he stays in form. Also on the turf on Friday, we saw Concrete Rose win the Edgewood over the highly anticipated return of Newspaper of Record. I want to get your take on the pace of this race and what happened in the early portion. Did you think Newspaper of Record had any kind of excuse? Was she just too keen, or was this a real step in the wrong direction for her?
And she just looked a little too keen. I mean, I'll be honest, it's a little bit troubling. Chad Brown usually brings his horses back ready to run. I think we were all expecting a big effort, and she looked like she was running one before she just maybe got a little short late. Big effort from Concrete Rose. She won a 112. I think that's the same or very similar to what Digital Age ran in the boys division on Saturday. I'm not sure what to make a Newspaper Record. I've seen a lot of these 3-year-old fillies come back, after a big 2-year-old campaign, and they just don't improve. They keep running about the same. It is Chad Brown, so it wouldn't shock me if this horse comes back and runs a 120 next time and pops a big one, but she's always going to be a short price. So I think as a bettor, you got to look at her with a bit of skepticism.
Yeah, and I think we should mention that Concrete Rose, I think she was the real story of this race, because she significantly improved on her prior efforts. Sure, Newspaper of Record took a step backwards, but bigger than that was the step forward that Concrete Rose took. So she really put herself in the conversation as a filly that's taken her game to the next level, because she finished, over 6 lengths ahead of the third place finisher. There was a real gap between first and second and third in this race. Newspaper of Record, if Concrete Rose hadn't been in the race, she would have won this race by almost 3 lengths with a 111 TimeformUS speed figure, and we'd be saying, oh, well, she came back with a pretty good effort. But she was just beaten by a horse that has really stepped forward and put her name in the conversation as a Grade 1 type filly among the 3-year-olds. Newspaper of Record, I don't know what they're going to do with her, because she gets so headstrong in these races. I wonder if she can stretch out to the 1.25 miles, which she'll need to do in a race like the Belmont Oaks Invitational. If that's what they decide to do. I don't think that there's any consideration of going to Royal Ascot. I think that's been debunked that they're considering that. So she's kind of a tricky horse. She probably is more of a flat mile kind of filly. There just aren't that many opportunities for her to do that among the straight 3-year-olds at this time of year. And she's got to settle early. She was way too keen in this race. I'm sure Chad Brown's going to make some adjustments to her training to try to get her to do that. But she clearly has a ton of talent. They just have to figure her out.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the thing with her, not knocking Concrete Rose at all. She ran a fabulous race. But if Newspaper of Record ran any of her races as a 2-year-old, she wins this race. So I do think it was a step backwards, but I do think it's something Chad Brown he's definitely going to try to fix. If anybody can do it, it'll be him, but we'll see. I will be skeptical when she comes back and is 3 to 5, and we'll see who's in against her.
Yeah. The other 3-year-old filly that put forth a breakout performance on Friday was Break Even in the 8 Bells. This filly is now undefeated in 4 career starts. she's really never been challenged for Brad Cox. He's just stepped her up after each win, and she rises to meet the challenge. She won this race by 5.5 lengths. I think that's the margin that she maintained around the entire course, because she never looked like she was in danger of losing this race, going fast every step of the way, never let them get into the race behind her. A 1:20 TimeformUS speed figure, far faster than the horses in the Kentucky Oaks ran. This filly is pretty good.
Yeah, I kind of called her on Twitter, put her past performances up and said she's kind of a Matoli light, where she had just been winning her races easy with a lot of blue fractions. But she proved she was the real deal with that 1:20. Not just, I mean, she ran away for some really fast horses in here. If you look, the horses who were 2nd through 5th early finished in the last 4 positions. They just couldn't keep up and got exhausted trying. And I would expect some of those to rebound with some big efforts. They just got ran off their feet by a horse that has potential to be a real superstar here. She was just blazing. I mean, to take it to these like that so early, it was always my favorite kind of horse. The one thing I would note in here, I did have her last race marked with a 106 as a tough figure to make because of the conditions that day. I went back and looked at the worksheet, thinking, well, maybe I blew it. Maybe it could have been faster. But all the other runbacks from the race don't really indicate that. I think this was just a breakout performance. I don't think she ran particularly fast last time out because she didn't have to. But she certainly did here, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where this one goes up next.
Yeah, I agree with that. And there was some talk after this race about the Churchill racetrack being speed favoring on Friday, and that kind of resurfaced when Serengeti Empress won the Kentucky Oaks in wire-to-wire fashion. I didn't really see that. I just wanted to briefly get your take on that. I didn't see the dirt as being necessarily speed favoring this day. I think we just saw some logical horses win on the dirt. There were some breakout performances, but also the track was changing so much with the different weather conditions that I don't see how you can really make that argument.
No, and that's something in TimeformUS, we code the days occasionally, but when the track changes so much, you'll never see that, or you shouldn't. I try to avoid that unless it's just painfully obvious. I didn't find the track particularly speed. I mean, it was speed favoring in the way that dirt tracks are speed favoring, not anything above the norm, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Speed is always going to be really dangerous on these cards, especially when some of the speed horses are simply the most talented horses in the race. And I think we saw a lot of that on Friday and Saturday at Churchill Downs. Before we wrap up the show, we'll just discuss some of the stakes action from Belmont Park last weekend, because there were some good horses in action. We'll begin with a dirt race on Saturday. It was the Westchester, which is the local prep for the Met Mile. I don't think we're going to be seeing any of these horses come back in the Met Mile as major players. But Nicodemus did win this race. He's a horse for Linda Rice, who she had thought highly of coming into this race. He had won an impressive victory in an allowance race earlier at Aqueduct. Didn't quite perform up to expectations in the stymie last time out, going the 2 turns. He liked getting back to the 1 turn here, but he really took advantage of the fact that Prince Lucky, who was the heavy favorite, just didn't seem to handle the slop whatsoever.
Yeah, I think Prince Lucky was the story. I mean, figure-wise, Nicodemus got a 118, so, it's a grade 3 horse, which I think is what the race is. He ran well enough. But Prince Lucky had run a pretty fast race a couple back, and then he had basically a walkover before the time after that. But he just didn't show up. Maybe it was a slop, but I was looking forward to him maybe being a Met contender. Maybe they'll give him a shot anyway, given how the track turned out. We'll see. It was definitely a disappointing effort.
Yeah, I thought Prince Lucky was going to be one of the top contenders in the Met Mile, but it's a little troubling that he put forth this effort. Could be the slop, but he really just never seemed comfortable and never was in this race. Nice to see Mike Luzzy get a graded stakes win. I know he doesn't get a ton of mounts in top races these days, but he typically rides well when he's on a live horse, and good to see him get this victory. And it was a hard-fought one, because Stan, the man who was second, was really trying to fight back at the end. A good battle to the finish. There were also 2 turf races on Saturday at Belmont Park. I was at Belmont this day. I was also in the New York area on Friday. There was a ton of rain last weekend, and the turf course just took an absolute beating at Belmont Park. Both of them did. And you could tell based on the times of these races that the turf course was just a complete bog. And Santa Monica, who won the Sheep's Head Bay, she obviously had no trouble handling it, whereas others in the race just didn't get over the surface nearly as well. She made a decisive move to the lead at the quarter pole, and that basically ended the race. Behind her, nobody else really ran.
Yeah, and I don't have a lot to add to that. I just want to say you'll notice in our chart there's no pace figures, and that's because they changed turf courses for this race. I think they didn't want to run two turf races on the same course given the conditions.
Yeah.
And basically, I have no baseline for this distance on that course because they just don't normally run it. So that's why I stuck with final time only numbers. The 120 solid for Santa Monica. That's about all I have to say on that one.
Yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot more to say about the Fort Marcy, which was won by Olympico, making his first start in this country for Chad Brown. Chad Brown had 3 runners in this race. Obviously, his top contender was the heavy favorite Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce had shown that he doesn't really have any kind of affinity for softer turf courses late last year when he lost the Turf Classic at Belmont and then was a no-show in the Breeders' Cup Turf. He's a horse that really does prefer firm turf courses. I was somewhat puzzled by the tactics on him in this race because Jose Lezcano, who was riding him, really came out with the intention to go to the lead on Robert Bruce, then sort of backed off in the early stages. That seemed like an odd choice to me, given how tiring the turf course was and the fact that he hadn't handled it in the past. It really did set it up for a stablemate, though, because Olympico, who prior to this in France had been a front runner, he didn't break well in this race, and that kind of forced Kendrick Carmouche's hand to rate him at the back of the pack. He got over the turf course better than anybody else and put forth a really effective late run to get by these horses. I'm just not sure what the result means given the conditions.
Yeah, given the conditions, I was going to say the same thing. I'm not sure we can put a whole lot of stock in this race. Kind of interesting you were saying about Robert Bruce. You never know what you're going to get with because you get a lot of riders riding the horses on Derby Day that don't really know the horses. So maybe that has something to do with it. I think Robert Bruce, didn't he make his breakout kind of last year, was his first race in this country on Derby Day when I think he won an allowance race that day?
No, it was actually the Fort Marcy. He was the defending champion in this race. That was a firm turf course, though, and he just didn't get over the yielding turf course this year.
Gotcha. Okay, that's right. I knew he had run on Derby Day. Yeah, he actually made what looked like a decent move and then just got swallowed up. So for him, I think you can draw a line through this. He'll probably get a better ride and firmer turf. I would imagine Chad Brown will try to avoid soft turf with him going forward because there's plenty of options to choose from in the summer. But this time of year he was there. It probably didn't hurt him to get that run in.
Yeah, and he's a horse that I had been watching some of his workouts prior to this race. It really seemed like he was coming into this return in top form. He was kind of almost outworking bricks and mortar, I believe, in some of these workouts. And if he's a horse that Chad Brown moves on to the Manhattan with on a firm turf course, he could be a price in that race or a better price than his stablemate. And I still think Robert Bruce is one of the top turf horses in the country. So I'll be interested to see what they do with him because this is just kind of a race that, for me, you draw a line through. It wasn't his best effort. On Sunday at Belmont Park, the one big stakes race was the Grade 2 Ruffian going a mile for the older fillies and mares. Only a 5-horse field, not the most competitive race, but it did feature the return of Come Dancing, who was exiting that gigantic performance in the Distaff handicap last month at Aqueduct, where she earned a 134 TimeformUS speed figure, a 114 Beyer speed figure, which makes her arguably the fastest horse in the country right now. She didn't run back to that performance, but she was visually impressive in victory once again.
Yeah, she didn't run back to it, and she didn't have to. Part of that was the pace was just a crawl early. All our fractions are in blue, so as I often explain, if you tell Usain Bolt to walk the first 20 meters, he's going to put up a very slow 100 for him. And that's basically what happened here. Her 134 was a figure we discussed. You kind of talked me into it. I was a little hesitant. But just because she ran a 122 to this day doesn't mean I think I made the wrong number. I think she earned that 134. And based on what we saw on Sunday, there's no doubt in my mind she could run it again if she needed to. She looked great from the second the gate opened. Her ears were pricked, and she looked like a horse who was going to win as she pleased, and she certainly did.
Yeah, she just seems like an older mare who's really feeling herself now. You can tell that she's running these races with so much confidence. She beat Pacific Wind in this race by over 6 lengths. I think Pacific Wind is a really good yardstick for speed figure makers to use because she just always seems to run the same race out there, regardless of conditions. And Come Dancing, I've heard that the next target for her is the Ogden Phipps. They're going to try to stretch her out again to the mile and a 16th of that race. Based on the form she's in now, I think she has to be considered a major player there, if not one of the horses to beat along with Midnight Bisou, because her speed figures, they put her right in the conversation along with the horse that won the La Troienne. She's a Julie. That's a race that I'm really looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, that would be great. And I think it helps that 1/16 is one turn, obviously, at Belmont. And she would fit right in there with those. And she'd be a horse I'd be tempted to bet because I think you'd get a little bit of a price on her.
Yeah, no, I think that's a race that I'm definitely looking forward to, along with all the Belmont Stakes Day Stakes races. But before that, we've got the Preakness Stakes coming up, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that on the podcast next week once we get a little more clarity on who's actually going to be running in the Preakness. I know we went through our entire Derby discussion, and we barely even mentioned the name. Perhaps we didn't even mention the name of Country House, who was elevated to win the race. He is the Kentucky Derby winner. It does sound like Belmont is going to come back and start him in the Preakness now, as he has acknowledged he kind of has an obligation to do so, even though that's not really Belmont style to run a horse back so quickly. I'll be interested to see how Country House does in that race. I think it will be great to see him come back and validate this performance. As we were saying, all of these 3-year-olds are so closely matched. They've been running such similar speed figures that I wouldn't be shocked if Country House has ascended to this level to be among the top horses in the division. But it's going to be a very competitive race, and we'll talk a lot more about it in the upcoming weeks. So, Craig, great to discuss these races with you as always. And you can check us out as always on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, DRF.com, YouTube, SoundCloud. Just search for Daily Racing Form, subscribe, and check out the TimeformUS Pacecast. We'll be back with more discussion of these races next week. And thanks for listening as always, guys. See ya.